1042 he arrived at Kiev with 11 ships. Not 11 warships, 11 longships loaded with Byzantine gold, silver, silk, and the accumulated plunder of 7 years of campaigning across 4 continents. The sources don't agree on the exact quantity. The Norse sagas have a tendency to round numbers upward when the subject is Harald's wealth, but the consensus is clear. He brought back more gold than any Norse warrior had ever returned with from Byzantine service. He was 27 years old. He had left Kiev at 19 as a commander of 500 warriors with nothing but his reputation and Yaroslav's letter of recommendation. He was returning as the most battle-experienced Norse commander alive, with wealth that made him a political force in Scandinavia without setting foot on Scandinavian soil. He went to see Yaroslav. The conversation was brief. The sources don't preserve it in detail, which suggests it was practical rather than dramatic. Yaroslav had known this was coming. He had been watching Harald's career from Kiev for 11 years. The Kievan Rus had extensive intelligence networks in Byzantium, and a former member of the Varangian Guard who had become its effective commander was not someone whose activities went unnoticed. He gave Harald his answer. Elizaveta would marry him. Harald finished the poem. The last verse of the Gammon Visor, the 16th stanza, the one that finally dropped the refrain about the girl who wouldn't have him, was composed in Kiev in 1042. It recorded his return, his wealth, his changed circumstances. It ended differently from all the previous verses. She had him now. But Norway was still waiting. He came back from Byzantium with enough gold to buy a kingdom and a wife who was worth more than the gold. What he found in Scandinavia was a nephew on the Norwegian throne who didn't want to share it, a war with Denmark that had been running for years, and the specific political situation that required him to be as dangerous with words and alliances as he had been with an axe in Sicily. This is the episode where the warrior becomes the king. Subscribe, like the video, and let's get into it. From Kiev, Harald moved to Sweden. The Swedish king Anund Jacob, who had his own complicated relationship with both Norway and Denmark, received Harald and allowed him to use Swedish territory as a base. This was not neutral hospitality. Anund Jacob had reasons to want a powerful destabilizing force available on the Norwegian-Danish border, and Harald with 11 ships of Byzantine gold and 500 battle-hardened warriors was exactly that. Harald began raiding Danish territory. This was not random aggression. It was a calculated opening move in a political campaign that Harald had been planning since before he left Byzantium. The situation in Scandinavia had shifted significantly during his 11 years of absence, and he had been tracking it from a distance with the attention of a man who knew he would eventually need to act on what he was learning. Norway was ruled by his nephew Magnus, Olaf's son, the boy who had sailed home from Kiev in 1035 at the age of 10 and somehow turned that impossible situation into a successful reign. Magnus had proven to be a genuinely capable ruler, not brilliant but steady, fair, and possessed of enough military ability to have won significant victories against the Danes who had backed the regime that killed his father. Denmark was ruled by Svein Estridsson, a nephew of the Great Nut, a man with a legitimate claim to the Danish throne and a long-running war with Magnus over it. Svein had been losing that war for years. Magnus had defeated him repeatedly on land and sea, and by 1042 Svein's position was precarious. Harald inserted himself into this situation with the precision of a man who had spent 7 years in Byzantine court politics. He allied with Svein. The alliance between Harald and Svein Estridsson is one of the most purely cynical political arrangements in Norse history, which is saying something given the standard. Harald needed a base in Scandinavia and military support he couldn't yet generate independently. Svein needed military capability he didn't have, specifically the kind of offensive naval and land warfare capability that Harald's Byzantine-trained warriors represented. They had nothing in common except mutual usefulness. They agreed to divide Norway between them when they took it. The agreement was always going to last exactly as long as it served Harald's interests and no longer. Svein probably knew this. He needed Harald more than Harald needed him, which meant he had less leverage over the terms, which meant he was going to end up on the worst side of the arrangement when it concluded. He agreed anyway because the alternative was losing to Magnus alone. Harald and Svein spent 1042 and the early part of 1043 raiding along the Danish-Norwegian coast, establishing Harald's presence, demonstrating his military capability, and forcing Magnus to respond to a threat on a frontier that had been quiet while he was focused on the main Danish war. Magnus responded. The two forces, Magnus' Norwegian fleet and the Harald-Svein coalition, met in several engagements in the waters between Norway and Denmark. The details of these engagements are preserved in the Norse sagas with varying reliability, but the strategic outcome is clear. Neither side achieved a decisive result. Stalemate. which suited Harald perfectly. Harald was not trying to destroy Magnus. He was trying to negotiate with him from a position of strength, to replicate, in the relationship between himself and his nephew, the arrangement that he had been unable to create with the Byzantine court. He wanted recognition, a share of power, a formal position within the political structure rather than a permanent war to overthrow it. The difference from Byzantium was that with Magnus, he had genuine leverage. The negotiations were conducted through intermediaries. The Norse political system had elaborate mechanisms for this, involving respected chieftains who could carry proposals between parties without either side having to formally acknowledge they were negotiating. The proposals went back and forth through 1043. Magnus' position was straightforward. He was king of Norway. His father had been king of Norway. He was not going to divide his inheritance with a man who had spent 11 years in Byzantium. Harald's position was equally straightforward. He was going to keep fighting until Magnus agreed, or until one of them was dead, and his Byzantine gold meant he could sustain the fighting considerably longer than Magnus could. The stalemate continued. Then something changed the calculation entirely. Magnus got sick. The sources are vague about what illness Magnus contracted in 1047, but its effects were not vague at all. He was incapacitated, clearly dying, and faced with the specific political problem that dying kings faced in the Norse world. Who got the kingdom? He had no legitimate sons. His options were limited and all of them had complications. Sweyn Estridsson was his enemy. Giving Denmark to Sweyn was something he had been fighting to prevent for years, but the alternative was a continued war that his successors would have to manage. Harald was his uncle. Giving Norway to Harald was acknowledging defeat in the negotiation he had been conducting for 4 years, but the alternative was a civil war after his death that would consume the kingdom. Magnus made his decisions with the pragmatism of a man who understood that he was not going to be alive to manage the consequences. He gave Denmark to Sweyn Estridsson. He gave Norway to Harald. The sources record that he told Harald, "I give you a kingdom that your brother, my father, Olaf the Holy One with his blood. Rule it well and be just." Magnus died shortly after, in October 1047. He was 23 years old. Harald was king of Norway. Harald's first act as king of Norway was to break his alliance with Sweyn Estridsson. This was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The agreement to divide Norway had been contingent on taking it from Magnus. Magnus had given it voluntarily. The agreement's premise no longer existed, and Harald had never been the kind of man who honored agreements past their useful life. Sweyn had been given Denmark by Magnus. Harald decided Sweyn should not have Denmark. The argument was dynastic. Harald claimed that the agreement between Magnus and Nut, which had established that whoever of the two survived the other would inherit both kingdoms, meant that Magnus' heir inherited Denmark as well as Norway. Sweyn's claim to Denmark was therefore illegitimate. The argument was also pretextual. Harald wanted Denmark. He wanted it because Denmark and Norway together were the North Sea power that Nut had built, the combination that made a Norse king a European power rather than a regional one. He wanted it because taking it would be the final demonstration that the boy who had tied his hand to his sword at 15 had become everything the Norse world valued in a king. He went to war with Sweyn. The war would last 15 years. The war with Sweyn Estridsson is the part of Harald's story that the popular narrative consistently skips over. People remember Stiklestad and the Varangian Guard and Stamford Bridge. The 15-year war with Denmark, the naval battles, the raids, the brutal back and forth of two determined men fighting over the same territory for a decade and a half, gets compressed into a paragraph or omitted entirely. It should not be omitted, because the war with Sweyn is where Harald the warrior becomes Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler. The man who governed Norway with the iron discipline that his Byzantine training had taught him power required. The man who burned towns that resisted him, who executed enemies without the specific Norse consideration of reputation that traditional political culture demanded, who ran a kingdom with the efficiency of a Byzantine general managing a military campaign. He was not a gentle king. He was not trying to be. He had watched his half-brother Olaf try to be a just and righteous king and die on a battlefield for it. He had learned different lessons from Stiklestad than the ones the church was teaching.